In the name of the Father, and Son, and the Holy Spirit, Amen. Welcome, everyone. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, we started the theme called the mountains of the Bible. And we started by talking about the mountain of promise. And then last week, we talked about the mountain of instruction. And tonight, we're concluding the theme by talking about the mountain of prayer. And we welcome Samuel to come and talk to us about the mountain of prayer. Welcome.
Okay, sorry about that. We're just trying to work out. There was a handout, and I said print 30 copies, and then I grabbed it as I was leaving, thinking that it was a bit thin, and it was because there's 7 copies. So we're trying to maybe get it emailed to you or something. But look, it's not a huge deal. I can just read out the quotes. But if you want them later, you can ask me for them. All right. That's not a bad idea. We could. Has it? There's 3 pages. If I can email it to you. Let's do that. Okay. We'll just start in the meantime. All right. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, Father, Son, Spirit, one God, Amen. Anyway, mountain of solitude. So just to kind of explain the theme, let me just give you a few verses, right? All from the Gospels. Now, it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. And another one. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So, point is, Jesus has this habit in the Gospels of going off to mountains, usually alone, not always. Sometimes he takes a couple of disciples with him, like Transfiguration. But most of the time he goes alone and he spends time praying to God. And just to kind of get us thinking and in the mood, there's something a little bit weird about that from the beginning, right? Because why does Jesus need to pray? He's God, right? And why does he need to go to a special alone place in order to pray? Isn't he the uncreated, only begotten Son of God? Doesn't he have this permanent connection to God? I think one way to answer that question is just to say, well, you know what, the question itself is kind of confused, because it's kind of like asking, does water need to be made out of H2O? The question doesn't make sense. That's what water is. Water is H2O. Water is by definition made out of H2O. So does Jesus need to pray? If prayer is just being in communion with God, does Jesus need to be in communion with God? The question doesn't make sense. It's who he is. As a human being, what Jesus is a human being who is constantly, completely in communion with God. But also, why would he go to a mountain? Why would he stand alone? Oh, that's awesome. Why would he sort of go off and seclude himself? Well, he does lots of things, like being baptized, like fasting, to give us an example, right? So he's trying to tell us something about the way that we can connect with God and follow his example, right? He goes off by himself to encourage us to also go off by ourselves. And really, all he's doing is giving us a practical demonstration of one of the spiritual instructions that he gives us. So in Matthew, you all know the verse, "You, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut the door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." So this is just idea in the New Testament, and it's in the Old Testament, it's in Christianity in general. Awesome. So we're up to 1b if you want to follow the quotes. That you find God at least in part. This isn't to say that there's no place for like communal liturgical prayer. Obviously, that's important too. But there's also this real emphasis on connecting with God on your own, in solitude, while there's no one else around. And in like spiritual ascetic tradition, that's what we call solitude, or like the people who do that for a living, the monks who do that for a living, we call them solitaries. Like, so Pope Kaldas, before he became Pope Kaldas, was known as Abuna Mina al-Mutawahhid, Father Mina, the solitary, the one who spent all his time alone. So what we want to do today, right, is figure out what it is about aloneness that connects us to God. Why is it that having no one else around in some special way gives us a connection to God? So I want to give like two suggestions, right? And I'll give you like a caveat in a second. Two suggestions are, right, the first one is that solitude brings us into contact with God because what solitude is, deep down, is a kind of death. Or a kind of cross, same thing. It's something that in itself is not good. Well, I'll explain that in a second. But something from which connection to God and great goodness can come. And the second thing is that solitude brings us into contact with God because even though it's a death, like the cross, it can be, when it's approached in the right way, a life-giving death, a healing death, just like Christ's on the cross. So there's a kind of paradox here, right? Because I'm not going to deny at all that loneliness is loneliness/solitude/isolation, that those are bad things in one sense, at least. But at the same time, they're given this special, like, we're encouraged to seek them out because through them, just like through death on the cross and martyrdom and all other forms of like Christian suffering, it offers a special way to connect with God. So the caveat I was going to give was that, this is complicated, and it's also something, like, obviously by definition, it's something very like personal to each of us, right? So I'm kind of just like hedging my bets and saying, I'm working through this myself, trying to think about how to get all of this to fit together. And I kind of worry that, like, just because of the way that my brain works, I'm trying to say a lot. And if I don't say everything that I'm saying at the same time, you'll think that I'm saying things that I'm not saying. So what I'm saying is try and like hold together all the things that I'm saying, so what you're hearing me saying is what I'm actually saying. If you get what I'm saying. So I hope that was clear. I'll try and explain. But all I'm saying is there's lots of moving parts to this picture that is sort of forming to me, and it's important to emphasize. If you emphasize some parts of it and not others, I think it could be very harmful. Right? That's really what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout way. Okay, cool. So unless there's any like questions, let me sort of take you into that first point, right? So the idea that solitude, even though it's this good thing that Christ is encouraging us to do, is a kind of death. And death in Christian thought is bad. There's really no way of getting around that. Good things come through death, and God turns death into a good thing. But first line in the prayer of reconciliation, it's a quote from the Old Testament, the Wisdom of Solomon. Death entered into the world by the envy of the devil, right? In the same book, God did not create death, but man summoned death by his own wicked works. So, like in Christian thought, death is not a good thing. God made everything to be alive, right? That's why he's the life and the light and so on. He didn't make darkness and death and evil. So death is a bad thing, right? And solitude, I'm suggesting, or loneliness, isolation, is a kind of death or a fruit of death. Best way to see that, so we're now at like 2a. Go to the very beginning of the whole biblical story. What's one of the first things that God says about the human being? He says, it's not good that man should be alone. It's pretty clear. Everything else, and theologians like to point out, that's chapter 2. In chapter 1, God creates everything, and he says immediately afterwards, it was good. He made the plants and it was good, and he made the sun and it was good, and so on and so on and so on. The first thing that's not good in Genesis is Adam alone. And there's a kind of question here too about why would God like create Adam alone and then sort of afterwards say, well, that's not good, let me fix it. Why wouldn't he just do the good thing from the beginning? Well, there's lots of ways to answer it, and it's probably not supposed to be clear. It's supposed to be there for us to think about. But an answer I really like, which I think comes from I'm just stealing it off Father John Bear. I think he got it from a Talmud contemplation or something. But one way to interpret it is, well, God wanted to teach Adam that it's not good to be alone. If he'd made him from the beginning with Eve, he wouldn't have known even what it means to be alone. So instead what he does is he creates Adam and he leaves him to name the animals. He does a few things in Genesis 2 by himself. And then it says, like, after he's done these things, but there was not found a helper fit for him. He noticed the lack of an other apart from God, someone like him who he could communicate with and share his life with. And so that's the point at which God steps in and brings Eve to him. And this is the sort of thing that psychologists nowadays really are confirming on lots of different fronts. So, it's not really my field, but I've been talking to lots of people and gathering resources. So, come talk to me afterwards if you want a cool reading list. Here's just one sample about this trend in psychology, where people are. So these guys are Christian psychologists. That's why they mention God. But to be, we were made for intimacy with God, intimacy with each other. The persistent human cry is simply for someone to love us, to hold us tight. Our need for a relationship is even more powerful than our need for food. And this is what I'm suggesting is built into the Genesis story. We were made not to be alone, but to be in communion both with God and with each other. So what does it mean to be in communion? What does it mean to not be alone? Best way to see the answer is just the answer that we get in the same chapter of Genesis. What does Adam get as an answer to the problem of it's not good that he should be alone? He gets Eve, and what he says when he sees Eve, it's Genesis 2:23. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And what that says to me, again, you could contemplate lots of things on that, but what that says to me is that what it means to not be alone is not just to be in the same place with someone. Adam was in the same place with lots of animals, wasn't really helping the loneliness situation. What really helped Adam was the fact that Eve internally was the same as him. Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. They were made of the same stuff. And he could see that, right? And literally she came out of his rib. And so when he looked at her, he could see something that was like him in a way that nothing else was. He could have a communion, or the sort of, the more secular term for what I'm saying, what I'm calling communion, is probably intimacy, right? It's a closer connection than just physically being located in the same place. And that's the thing that heals Adam's loneliness, the not goodness of him being alone. So I think that's fairly safe, right? Loneliness by itself is not, in itself, is a kind of death. And the way that you can tell that is the relationship between Adam and Eve breaks down the second that they sin. Because the first thing that Adam says when God comes to him is not, I sinned, I ate the apple. Remember what he says? It was the woman that you gave me, right? He's putting up this barrier between him and Eve. Now they're no longer one flesh. She did it, nothing to do with me. And so, things really went downhill from there, right? Okay, so the suggestion is that what loneliness is, when we experience loneliness as a pain, as a suffering in life, that's one of the fruits of the fall, right? It's part of the breakdown of the plan that God had initially for human beings, which was to live and be in communion with him. So how is it that this loneliness, this being alone, becomes this spiritual benefit, right? This thing that monks and nuns and desert fathers seek to live their whole life alone because it connects them to God? Well, see, here's the thing, right? So first thing we've got to do is make a distinction between solitude, which is this Christian virtue of going off and being on your own in order to find God, and another problem, which I think is more relevant to us, I'll tell you why, which we could call loneliness, right? So there's a difference between loneliness and solitude, at least the way that I'm going to use the words now. The difference is that solitude, like we said, is something you do voluntarily, right? So if you're a holy person like St. Anthony or St. Paul, you feel this need to be really in communion with God. You find that being in the world and with people tends to distract you from that. You want to devote your whole life to God. So you willingly go out into the desert where there's no one else, and you spend all your time just with yourself and with God. That's solitude. And that experience is not necessarily the same thing as loneliness, right? When you look at St. Anthony, when you look at St. Isaac the Syrian, look at Abu Namin al-Mutawahid even, like look at what they were writing while they were out in the desert alone. They don't seem, it's not like it was easy, obviously, but they don't seem lonely. They don't seem to feel abandoned and weak and terrified. They're pretty comfortable with God, even though they're suffering a kind of death. Loneliness is different, though, and this is really important because I think, especially if we're trying to think about this, we're not desert fathers or mothers. We're 21st century Christians, and it's a very rare vocation, like just proportionally, most Christians aren't called to go into the desert and live completely alone. Most of us are supposed to be Christians here, where we are as 21st century Copts. So what does this mean for us? Well, like fortunately or unfortunately, probably a bit of both, there is a sense in which just living like in the countries that we do, like as immigrants from Egypt, in like Western countries, there's a kind of solitude that's forced upon us just by the fact of the way our society works. And that's what I'm calling loneliness. So let me give you a description. This one's not on the handout, but let me just sort of read it out to you. This is from a guy called Henry. Oh, it's really, if I'm going to be fancy in French, it's Henry Nouwen. Wrote lots of amazing books, some of which I believe you have in the back there. This is from one called Reaching Out, and one of the subtitles is From Loneliness to Solitude, which is where I got the idea. So he's trying to describe what loneliness is, right? Here's the description. And what I want you to pay attention to is in these scenarios that he's going to describe, how many of them involve actual lack of contact with people? How many of them involve actual physical isolation? You might have felt loneliness as a little child when your classmates laughed at you because you were cross-eyed, or as a teenager when you were the last one chosen on the baseball team. You might have felt it when you were homesick in a boarding school or angry about nonsense rules which you could not change. You might have felt it as a young adult in a university where everyone talked about grades, but where a good friend was hard to find. And you might still feel it day after day during staff meetings, conferences, counseling sessions, long office hours, or just when you're by yourself staring away from a book that cannot keep your attention. Practically every human being can recall a similar or much more dramatic situation in which he or she has experienced that strange inner gnawing, that mental hunger, that unsettling unrest that makes us say, I feel lonely. So if you were kind of following the scenarios, pretty much all of them involved people who were physically surrounded by people, and not just physically surrounded, but they were interacting with people, right? They were on baseball teams, in meetings, going to conferences, etc., right? These aren't people who are in the desert and they're lonely because they can't find anyone to talk to. If anything, they're overwhelmed with contact from people, and yet that doesn't mean that they're not lonely. That's a really important point. And whatever this pain is, it doesn't mean being cut off from human contact. It means something deeper. So he goes on. This is 2b now, to kind of describe what exactly this internal experience, this inner hunger is. 2b, just the bottom there. The roots of loneliness are very deep. They find their food in the suspicion that there is no one who cares and offers love without conditions, and no place where we can be vulnerable without being used. The many small rejections of every day, a sarcastic smile, a flippant remark, a brisk denial, or a bitter silence may all be quite innocent and hardly worth our attention if they did not constantly arouse our basic human fear of being left totally alone with darkness as our one companion left. So what loneliness really is, it's not a sense that there's no one around. It's a sense that there's no one friendly around. There's no one who, there's no one with whom we have to, we can kind of let our guard down, right? We have to be constantly putting on some sort of defense, because if they discovered what's really going on inside, or the fact that we're not as smart or as good looking or whatever, right? Some condition that we fail to meet, then all of a sudden we would lose their affection and approval. And so there's this need to kind of put up a barrier. That's what loneliness is. And in fact, you can feel more lonely, if that's what loneliness is, you can feel more lonely when surrounded by the wrong kind of people than you can when you're completely isolated, not in contact with anyone. Okay, so like, that's unpleasant, and I think we're all familiar with that feeling. It's just part of the human condition. But what you could say, and occasionally people do, is, well, that's a first world problem, right? Like, okay, you feel a bit lonely, boohoo, go cry on your big pile of like salary and money and electricity and water that comes out of a tap, etc. You know, like, it's not that bad. And you know, that's an important point, because there are probably worse kinds of suffering, but here's the thing, right? I think that in a way they're right. Loneliness is a first world problem. But that doesn't mean that it's like a fake first world problem, like my Wi-Fi is not working, or like I ran out of data and Vodafone charges me too much, which is a legit problem that I like seriously have. It's not one of those, because that's not really a problem, right? You just suck it up, get some more, get a different plan. This is a problem, like a first world problem, in the sense that it's a problem that we have in the first world that you don't have in other places. It's a problem that you have because of the way that what we call first world countries work. And to kind of get some backup here, I'm going to bring in an expert on like poverty and suffering, Mother Teresa, right? If anyone knows about poverty and suffering, it's Mother Teresa, right? And this is one of the things that she said. The greatest disease in the West today is not TB or leprosy. It is being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for. We can cure physical diseases with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, despair, and hopelessness is love. There are many in the world who are dying for a piece of bread, but there are many more dying for a little love. The poverty in the West is a different kind of poverty. It is not only a poverty of loneliness, but also of spirituality. There's a hunger for love as there is a hunger for God. I think she's very, very right? Like, you know, especially if you serve in Sunday school. Like, I've only been doing it for like 5 years, but my sense is like every year it's noticeable that like there are more and more people who are like off the rails. You know, they look to their parents and to their like Sunday school teachers like they're off the rails. But it's really like, if you push and figure out what's going on, it's really something like this, right? They're surrounded by people. They might even have a great group of friends and everything. But there's this sense in which they feel that they don't belong, or that they're kind of a fake, right? You all know what I'm talking about, especially in a Coptic community. You know, like, we have very high standards academically and socially and so on. And there's this fear, I think, in a lot of us, that if we were to be exposed on certain fronts, you know, if you found out my last exam mark, or if you found out whatever, you know, then suddenly I would not be so welcome in the community, right? That's what we're calling loneliness, right? It's this sense that there's no real place to be yourself. You have to be something else. And that's a problem that, I think is very prominent in the first world. Why is it prominent like in the first world? Like, why is this such a like conspicuous problem here? It's not really the point of tonight. Like, you know, the question is, how are we going to turn it into a productive spiritual solitude? But I think it's important to think, like, just briefly about where this problem came from. What are the causes? So, like, 2 quick suggestions, right? First one, this is now 1D, is the idea of rivalry or competition. Okay, so when Nguyen is sort of going on and explaining, one of the things he says is, our contemporary Western society has heightened the awareness of our loneliness to an unusual degree. We become increasingly aware that we are living in a world where even the most intimate relationships have become a part of competition and rivalry. You can see what he means, I think, by, if you think back to the most competitive situation you've ever been in. For me, it's like post-grad uni in the humanities, right? No one wants to admit that, I mean, there are exceptions, but no one wants to admit, if you get a bad mark on an essay, do not tell anyone next to you, because, we've got to get a job. There's not many jobs, and, if you're going to get a job, you want to be applying for fellowships and things like that. You want to be making the right connections, and you don't want the word on the street to be, Sam wasn't doing too well in that last essay, because that's going to be a problem, right? I hear that, every high stakes field is pretty much the same. The picture that you want to project is that you're it's all pretty much smooth sailing for you. You're just kind of sailing through without really trying, doing everything amazingly. If you were to suggest that that's not the case, if you were to let on, then you'd be afraid that you would suffer for it, right? So you can't be yourself, because obviously postgrad philosophy and postgrad medicine and all these stressful situations are very, very stressful, right? It's kind of like hilarious that all these people are walking around with these like smiles, like, you know, like they've tied their cheeks up to their ears so that they look like they're smiling. They're really like, you know, really, really stressed. And the ones that admit it are a lot happier, right? Because they're free to be themselves. But I think that's the problem that he's getting at, right? One of the things that causes loneliness is the fact that we feel in our very competitive, goal-oriented society that to admit your real self, that you're just a human being, you know, and that it's often quite difficult to meet all these standards, is a kind of weakness, right? It's a failure to be what you're supposed to be. Abuna Matan Miskin puts that really, really well, as like a general spiritual principle. Our world is weary and exhausted because everyone is vying to see who is the greatest. There is a ruthless competition between governments, churches, peoples, within families, from one parish to another. Who of us is the greatest? The world is festering with painful wounds because of this great illness. Who is the greatest? And he's quoting there, of course, like even the disciples did it, right? You know, they debated among them on the road, who is the greatest? And they probably lost their fellowship for that moment. When that was the question, who is the greatest? They couldn't be proper disciples. So that's the first one, right? This idea of like rivalry and connection, because it makes love conditional. It makes us think that people will love us if we meet standards X, Y, and Z. If we don't, then they won't. The second one is superficiality. Because remember we were saying, like, what is it that heals Adam's loneliness? It's not just like the fact that someone else who looks like him comes along. It's the fact that someone else who is like him, whom he can really be himself with, comes along. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. They have communion or intimacy. And even though we have a very like busy society where we're constantly in contact with people, we tend not to, like, partly for the reasons that we just saw, like about competition, but for other reasons too, we tend to have very like superficial connections with each other as well. So Nguyen again, there's two 1Ds, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the one. He's just talking about the way that we talk to each other in our society, right? The language we use suggests anything but loneliness. Please come in. It is so good to see you. It was so great to talk to you and have a chance to visit to you. Come back soon. And I cut out like 50 others there. He got a bit sarcastic. It's a language that reveals a desire to be close and receptive, but that in our society sadly fails to heal the pains of our loneliness, because the real pain is felt where we can hardly allow anyone to enter. In a way, this is the same point as the one before, right? But we kind of make do with very superficial connections, you know, small talk, kind of like ignoring the elephant in the room often. Because to like meet intimately with anyone, and I'm not talking about romantic relationships necessarily, like obviously it applies there, but I'm just talking about general, genuine human connection, right? To meet someone else, anyone, on a real human level where you're admitting, like, you know, deepness in yourself, what's really going on, that requires vulnerability. That requires like the chance that the other person will say something wounding or will not reciprocate or whatever, you know. Just take the kind of anxiety that you have in romantic relationships and project it out to all relationships, because it's the same thing, right? Just it's especially intense in romantic relationships and family relationships. And so like a really great, interesting description of what a society that is like this looks like was written like back in, I forgot to write down the date, I think it was like 1863, like, you know, a good 150 years ago, by Henry David Thoreau, right? Who, interestingly, like part of what he did in his life was he spent a year in a house by himself in a forest. He wrote a book about it called Walden, which I haven't read, but people at my uni are obsessed with it, so that's how I came across this. But he wrote in the newspaper, right, his description of what he felt was happening in his society, and that was one of the things that drove him to go and live on his own for a year. Describing sort of people's interactions, he says, well, really what it is surface meets surface. When our life ceases to be inward and private, conversation degenerates into mere gossip. We rarely meet a man who can tell us any news which he has not read in a newspaper or been told by his neighbour. In proportion as our inward life fails, we go more constantly and desperately to the post office. You may depend on it that the poor fellow who walks away with the greatest number of letters, proud of his extensive correspondence, has not heard from himself in a long while. If you want to modernize that, just swap post office and letters for smartphone and notifications, right? Because I do this too, like we all do it, right? This desperate need to like just see, you know, if you have 5 minutes alone in a bank line or while you're waiting for coffee, the first thing that you do is you've got to reach out and see, well, does anyone love me today? Does anyone, you know, Is my phone, am I active? Am I communicating with people? Are we really communicating with people? Like if we're really happy that we got a message that there's a 50 Snapchats and whatever, have we really like connected with anyone else? Or have we just sort of like bumped surface to surface? And the interesting, like we'll get to this like just at the very end, but the really interesting thing about that quote to me is this idea that it's not just that we've lost contact with each other. We've, in a weird, like paradoxical way, even though the problem here is like loneliness, that we're alone, we've lost contact with ourselves. That's that last sentence. The person who is so obsessed with receiving things from the post office is someone who has not heard from himself in a long while. That's why he's going to the post office. He needs something in his mental space. He's not looking inside, he needs something from outside. And the paradoxical, sad thing about that is that it means that when he meets someone else, he's got nothing to say except what he picked up from the newspaper or what was sent to him at the post office. He doesn't have a self to share with someone. I mean, he does have a self, but he's buried it under this pile of letters or notifications or whatever. So we'll come back to that, but I think that's also really important. So second, first cause of loneliness, the fact that we need to not be vulnerable, we need to be very strong and fake mask wearing in a way. And then the second thing is like the fact that the human contact that we do have tends to be very surface level. Okay, so where does all this leave us? And I'll get back to like the happy bit, the solitude, in a moment. To kind of like theologize all of this, put it in terms of the gospel and Christianity, the problem that we're talking about, like loneliness in Western society, is a kind of death that results from sin. And this is one of those things where, like, don't hear me saying like half of what I'm saying. When I say death that results from sin, I don't mean like if person X is lonely, it's because he swore at Amur Fauzi last week and God is now punishing him with loneliness as a result of his sin. I don't mean like personal sin. I mean, it's what Orthodox theologians like to call ancestral sin. The fact that Adam sinned, sin caused the world to fall. Like the fallenness of the world, right? The fact that the world is not what God made it to be. That's what I mean. And so Alexander Schmemann puts this really, really well, as he usually does, right? There is no other life but God's life. It's 1F, yeah. The one who rejects it dies because life without God is death. This is the spiritual death, the one that fills the entire life with dying. And being separation from God makes man's life solitude and suffering, fear and delusion, enslavement to sin and enmity, meaninglessness, lust, and emptiness. It is this spiritual death that makes man's physical death truly death, the ultimate fruit of his death-filled life. A total separation, total solitude, total darkness. And as long as we do not recover this Christian vision and feeling of death as the horrible and sinful law and content of our life, of death as reigning in this world, we will not be able to understand the significance of Christ's death for us and for the world. For it is this spiritual death that Christ came to destroy and abolish. It is from this spiritual death that he came to save us. The reason that's so important, apart from the fact that it's awesome because it's Schmemann, is that the next, like the final part is going to be, like the title of the talk suggested, the spiritual value of solitude, right? How we can use our loneliness, our lack of connection from people, to reconnect with God and reconnect with ourselves and even reconnect with each other. But what's really important, and why I wouldn't want that to be the only thing that you take away from what I'm saying, is at the same time, it only works because it's bad. It only works because it's a kind of death. You never want to like sort of pretend that something which is evil is good, right? Woe to those who call good evil and evil good. Let's not do away with that. God didn't make us to be isolated and alone. He made us for communion with himself and with each other. That's really important. And the reason it's important is because one thing that you could take away from the message that, we should be like St. Anthony, we should be happy in solitude, is like, well, you know what? I don't need intimacy. I don't need connection with people. I'm fine. I'm just going to love everyone. I'm just going to sort of like buck up, be okay, it's all good. If you were to do that, I mean, I wouldn't want to be like helped by you, because you're not going to last too long, right? It's going to be really bad for you and really bad for the people that you tried to help, because what you've done is not like faced your loneliness and then worked through it. You've just kind of shoved it aside, right? It's not a sustainable situation. So that's really what I don't want you to take away from this, right? That like there's nothing wrong with being alone. It's, you know, like it's nothing wrong with feeling disconnected from people and whatever. No, like it's a legitimate, like, you know, you can take it from secular psychologists or from the Bible. It's not good for men to be alone. You know, you need intimacy and like deep connection with people as much as you need food and water. And when you don't have them, you're in pain, like in the same way that you would be if you were starving. That's important to like acknowledge, and you can't sort of push that under the rug. Okay, right. With that said, like with that important caveat in place, we can get to the idea of what we can do with the fact that we and people around us and the people we serve and the people that are related to us and so on are in this situation where, largely not due to our choice, we're in a society that sort of encourages or promotes loneliness unintentionally. Okay, so there's like 3 parts to the solution, right? Yeah, so we're now, yep, good. All right. The first one is what like I was hinting at the end of that quote by Henry David Thoreau. The first step is not necessarily, I mean, the end goal obviously is to reconnect with God and reconnect with people around us. But the first step, and this is as true in like monastic Desert Father literature as it is in like secular psychology, the first step is to reconnect with yourself, not with anyone else at the moment. What do I mean by that? Well, here is Nguyen again, so this is 2a. The thing is, because we're so like starved for intimacy and that's so painful, we tend to not face the fact that we are lonely, right? That's kind of the funny and sad thing about it. Because it's a painful experience, what we try and do is ignore it as much as possible, which is why we kind of, you know, if you get like a bit restless just in a line waiting for things when you just have some time to yourself, that's kind of what's going on, right? Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, in Beginning to Pray, which you guys also have here, has this kind of hilarious little like challenge that he gives to the person reading the book. It's sort of like a guide on how to start praying. And he says, no, you know what, the first thing you need to do is not pray, just do this, right? Just go to a room and sit alone for 5 minutes and don't think anything. Just sit there with your thoughts and just see what happens. And he bets that you won't be able to last 5 minutes. And then he makes this really like snarky comment, which is like, well, if you can't sit with yourself for 5 minutes, why do you think anyone else would want to like sit with you for 5 minutes? And he's making in a really snarky Russian way that point that Henry David Thoreau made, which is if you don't have time with yourself, you don't have a self to give to others. But that's the first step, right? You need to be in contact with yourself if you're going to connect meaningfully either with God or with other human beings. And so I think I can skip that. I'll skip the first one, go to the second one. So, like I said, this is in the monastic tradition, right? This is where, like Pope Shenouda is kind of summarizing it here in the Release of the Spirit, when he says, a person who does not experience seclusion does not know his real self. He is often carried by the current, not knowing where he's going. He thinks with the mentality of the group, following their path. So he falls and continues in his fall till he comes to himself and becomes aware of his fall. I like that especially because part of what he's suggesting is that when you don't have knowledge of yourself, when you don't connect with yourself, what happens is other people give you a self. You know, whatever is happening, you just sort of go with the current. There wouldn't be peer pressure wouldn't work if we knew who we were, because then that's great that you guys are doing that. I kind of know who I am, but it's only because we don't have a stable foundation in ourselves that we're kind of carried along with the current. I think that's the point being made here. So the first thing that we have to do then is to come to know ourselves. And one of the most beautiful ways that that's put, St. Isaac the Syrian, it's not that quote, and it's another one, just it's stuck in my head. But he said famously, to know oneself is a greater miracle than raising the dead. And in a way, there's this weird sense in which all the ascetical literature, like all these monks sitting in their rooms trying to pray and fast constantly, one of the ways that they describe what they're doing is they're trying to know themselves, because that's how they can know God. So that's the first thing, right? The first thing, as a practical point, what I'm saying is when we find that we have this inner hunger and this sort of discontentment because there's a lack of meaningful connection, don't ignore it. Don't say, oh, well, that's not what a Christian should feel. I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to go and love people more. No, you have to sit with it because it's part of who you are, right? The more that you bury it, the less you acknowledge it, the less authentically you're going to be, the less real a self you're going to have to take to either God or anyone else. So that's the first thing, right? Like, learn to sit with yourself, whatever is down there, right? And then the next thing that happens is, once you've found yourself, from there you can turn and find God. And this is a bit of a, I said this was going to be the happier part of the talk. So, sorry about this, but it's a little bit miserable, because what all the spiritual literature says as well, that I've read, maybe I've been reading the wrong stuff, is that the first thing that you find when you know yourself is that you're really screwed up. Like, you've got a lot of problems, and the longer you look at it, the more disturbed you're going to get. In the same book, Beginning to Pray, Anthony Bloom quotes someone. He says, "You're really like a shaving of wood, right? When you shave wood and it's this little curled piece of wood, and slightest bit of pressure, you'll just crack, right? And you've lived your whole life not noticing that. You've tried to have a job and a career and a family and whatever. You've tried to put lots of things sort of around you to focus your attention on that, whereas really you are just this little shaving of wood with no center, right? It's a little bit of matter curved around a hollow center. And what it means to sit with yourself, especially when you're feeling lonely and disconnected, is to really face up to that. And that's not fun. It's not supposed to be fun. It's, the St. John of the Cross wrote a book called The Dark Night of the Soul. I haven't read it, but I'm pretty sure that's what he's talking about, right? It's not, this is the bad part. And Anthony Bloom puts that really, really well. So it's the second quote, very often, same book. "Very often we do not find sufficient intensity in our prayer, sufficient conviction, sufficient faith, because our despair is not deep enough. We want God in addition to so many other things we have. We want his help, but simultaneously we're trying to get help wherever we can, and we keep God in store for our last push. If our despair comes from sufficient depth, if what we ask for, cry for, is so essential that it sums up all the needs of our life, then we find words of prayer, and we will be able to reach the core of the prayer, the meeting with God." So that's not a comfortable thing, but essentially what he's saying is, you wonder why prayer never seems to really connect you with God. It feels like you're just sort of talking to the empty air in front of you. Like, part of the reason is because you are not you're not desperate enough yet, right? You don't know how much you need God, and in that sense, you're not really coming to him with the kind of sincerity and authenticity that he needs from you in order to be able to reach you. You still have your defenses up. A talk that I was listening to from a Coptic priest in America the other day, like to prepare for this, he was saying, you're unraveling. You're like a piece of wool, and you're unraveling, and you don't know it. And the only way that you're going to stop is by looking at it. You have to just sit and look at the fact that you're unraveling. But the beautiful thing is, this isn't something crazy or new. This is the whole pattern in the whole Bible, right? My favorite example is from Deuteronomy, right? But just think for yourselves of how many other examples you could find in the Old Testament even. And what I'm talking about is stories where, pretty much always, anyone in the Old Testament who connects with God in a meaningful way is someone who first tried to do it themselves and then failed, and realized how much they needed God and then came back to him. My favorite example, because it's one we often fail to notice, because this kind of took me by surprise, is in Deuteronomy, right? So in Deuteronomy, the Israelites have just come into the promised land, and God through Moses is telling them what's going to happen, basically. So basic message is, if you follow the commandments and you stick to me, everything's going to be great, your grain houses will be full, and you'll defeat your enemies, and you'll be safe, and milk and honey, and good stuff, right? If you don't, things are going to be really bad. You will have you'll have famines, and your enemies will take you and scatter you, and even though you were going to be as the sand of the sea, you're going to be very few in number, and so on. But then, it was weird to me that I hadn't noticed this before. He sort of changes tone, and he stops saying, if you do good, then it'll be good, and if you do bad, then it'll be bad. It stops being a warning, and it becomes a prophecy in it, a few parts in Deuteronomy. Because he stops saying if then and just starts saying will, right? This is one of them. "And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations, where the Lord will drive you. And there you will serve gods, the works of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell." It's not if you disobey, I know you're going to disobey. I'm God. I've special spoilers. I can see. You are going to disobey, and you will be scattered, be left few in number, be serving idols, and so on. he knows that it's going to happen, right? The whole idea of the promised land, like he knows that he's promised the promised land on the condition that they have the faith of Abraham, but he knows at the same time that they're not going to keep it. But the weird thing is, and it's one of those things that in a way you only really notice looking back in light of the New Testament, is that in a way, and this is one of the things I've got to be careful about saying, just the right way, in a way it was supposed to happen that way. Okay, not supposed to in that God doesn't cause sin, right? Of course, obviously, God would have preferred that the Israelites kept his commandments and lived happily in the promised land. But he's God, right? He knows what's going to happen, and he went through with it anyway. Why? Because he knew that the exile itself, the fact that they suffered as a result of their sin, was going to bring them about and actually fulfill the promise. So the very next verse, right? He says, you'll be exiled, left few in number, scattered among the nations. But verse 29, but from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him, if you seek him with all your heart and all your soul. When you are in distress, and all these things come upon you in the latter days, when you turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice, for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them. I can't resist saying, because I love it so much, another verse from Deuteronomy that I didn't put here. And this only, if you look this up in the NKJV, it's not going to work because it's only in the Septuagint. So only Greek church fathers talk about this. If you read it in Latin or like the Hebrew, the sort of pun doesn't work. But there's another similar passage where he's saying, and it's going to be really bad, you're going to sin really badly, and like there's going to be so few of you left. And then he says, God says to them, and your life will hang in doubt before you, and you shall not believe in your life. Right? In context, what that means is you're going to come so close to stopping existing as a nation, your life will hang before your eyes, right? Your life will dangle before you as though it's going to fall and pass away forever. And that's the like utmost peak of Israel's calamity as a result of their sin. But then St. Athanasius comes along and reads this later, and on the Incarnation he says, you know what, the crucifixion was prophesied clearly even in the Old Testament, even in Moses. Because here Moses says, your life shall hang before your eyes. Because Jesus is our life, and in 30 AD, he's going to hang before your eyes. Israel's going to stand, and your life, capital L, life, is going to hang before your eyes. And you shall not believe in your life, because the ones who were in front of him didn't believe. I think that's just it's a really interesting example of how church fathers read the Old Testament. Because you could make a good case that Moses had no idea that Athanasius was going to use it that way. Was he wrong? Very interesting. But the most beautiful thing is, like, he takes the most drastic, dramatic, tragic part of Israel's future, where their life is hanging before their eyes, they're on the brink of extinction. And that's the point at which Jesus comes and everything turns around. Why am I saying all of that? Because the point is that when you find yourself, and when you find that you're really screwed up, you really are kind of unraveling, you've got nothing in yourself that's going to fix it, that's exactly the point at which you can really pray, where you can really connect with God in a way that you can't when you're feeling self-sufficient and satisfied and everything else. So the point is, like, not to be afraid of facing up to the sense of, inner crumbling and disconnection and so on, because as painful as it is, that's where you find God. And then the last point, so I'm pretty much done, is that paradoxically what happens then is that you are able properly to connect with others in your solitude. So St. Isaac the Syrian floats around on Facebook a lot, and it's really weird. Abuna Dan loves this quote because he sees it a lot in Pope Corollas' life. Be the friend of all, but in your spirit remain alone. And there's this weird theme in St. Isaac the Syrian, right, where he's really big on like charity and sharing in others' suffering and picking people up and supporting them and so on. But at the same time, he has this real emphasis on inner solitude. Like, so at the same time, you're both completely alone, but because you're alone, you're able to help others. The reason that's so important, right, is because here's another one of those things that I'm saying you have to hear me saying alongside everything else. Because one wrong way to hear what I was saying at the beginning about, it's so bad that our society lacks intimacy and we have superficial connections, is to say, I am really messed up. You know what I need? I really need to find someone, the nearest available source of support. I'm just going to unload all my baggage and anger and loneliness and disconnection and whatever, and they're going to fix me, right? Abuna or relative or anyone, right? And then what I need is someone else. Someone else is going to come and take away my loneliness. That's what's going to fix the problem. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. By all means, we should all have more intimate connections. But there is a real problem with thinking that anyone, like even the most Christian, loving, self-sacrificing person, could fix the wound that every one of us has just as a result of being, children of Adam. St. Anthony the Great, in letters that he wrote to this monk, he has this phrase that he uses over and over again: the great wound of man, the great incurable wound of man, which none of the prophets and the apostles could heal. Only God could heal it. And what he's talking about is disconnection from God, because that's the real problem, right? That's why St. Isaac or St. Anthony can be in the desert and not see another human face for 10 years. I suppose that's not St. Anthony, I suppose St. Paul maybe. And still they don't feel the pain of loneliness, right? They feel filled because God has healed the great wound of man in them. But it's really important, every time St. Anthony mentions it, he says, which none of the prophets or apostles could heal, right? Only God can heal that. Only Jesus can heal that. So that's really important, right? You can't approach someone else and try and get over the loneliness. You can soothe the pain. It helps, definitely, to be able to talk to someone. But no connection, not a marital one or a priestly one or any connection, is able to, in itself, take away the need that we all have to face up to our own inner, great wound of man. And so no one puts this really well. No friend or lover, no husband or wife, no community or commune will be able to put to rest our deepest cravings for unity and wholeness. Friendship and love cannot develop in the form of anxious clinging to each other. They ask for gentle and fearless space in which we can move to and from each other. And the thing is that when we have that sort of self-sufficiency, then we're able to properly connect with other people, right? He goes on, without solitude of heart, the intimacy of friendship, marriage, and community life cannot be creative. Without solitude of heart, our relationships with others easily become needy, greedy, sticky, clinging, dependent, sentimental, exploitative, and parasitic. Because without the solitude of heart, we cannot experience the others as different from ourselves, but only as people who can be used for the fulfillment of our own, often hidden needs. That's why I was emphasizing before, the real message here is not to bury the wound, right? Don't pretend that you don't have it. Don't try and be a hero, as we all often do, and just sort of say, oh, well, I'm going to be like St. Anthony. I don't need anyone. I'm just going to go and pray in my room. That'll do me. Because it doesn't work, right? And the other solution to try and go and find someone else to take away the necessity of doing that, of facing up to it ourselves, doesn't work either, right? The only thing that works is, annoyingly, the painful thing, which is sitting with it, facing up to it, facing up to the fact that we don't have in ourselves enough to, even if we've got plenty of food and water and people surrounding us, there is still, just by our spiritual condition in a fallen world, there's a great wound of humanity within us. And there's nothing to do with it except face up to it. That's all you can do. Good news is that when you do that, you find God, and that helps quite a bit, pretty much fixes it, even though it's a constant struggle. Okay, cool. So I'm pretty much done, and I'm really proud of myself because that was not an hour and 10 minutes, which is what I normally do. That was 40. So let me just read one quote, to sort of sum all of this up, again from the same book that I've quoted a lot. The main message, right? Instead of running away from our loneliness and trying to forget or deny it, we have to protect it and turn it into a fruitful solitude. To live a spiritual life, we must first find the courage to enter the desert of our loneliness and to change it by gentle, persistent efforts into a garden of solitude. This requires not only courage, but also strong faith. As hard as it is to believe that the dry, desolate desert can yield endless varieties of flowers, it is equally hard to imagine that our loneliness is hiding unknown beauty. The movement from loneliness to solitude, however, is the beginning of any spiritual life, because it is the movement from the restless sense to the restful spirit, from the outward-reaching cravings to the inward-reaching search, from the fearful clinging to the fearless play. So yeah, by all means, read, any book of his is amazing, but reaching out is also a good one. So yeah, I hope that all the things that I said that have to be said at the same time were said at the same time, right? I think I could stop there, unless there are any questions or comments. Cool.
Samuel, don't go anywhere. I've got a question for you. I haven't finished yet. Thanks so much, Samuel. It's a very deep topic that Samuel just gave, and I love the angle. And I think it's a major, actually, problem that we face in our society in terms of loneliness. And from many people I speak to and many people that talk to me, a lot of people actually fear facing themselves. For them, it's something very fearful. They try to escape from facing themselves and actually sitting down with themselves. And it's hard to get someone to take quiet time. When you tell someone to take a quiet time, go and meditate and sit down by yourself, it's actually something intimidating for some people, and they try to escape from themselves. So in your talk, you said people need to find or to know themselves. The question is, how do you know yourself? How do you get to reach that stage? How? I know that's a difficult question to answer, but the question is, like, when I'm sitting with myself, what am I trying to do? Just give us your thoughts. When I'm sitting with myself, what do I do? Because my thoughts go everywhere. I could be thinking about the problems in my life. I could be thinking, how do you direct it?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's a really hard question. And I feel like if I was going to answer it, it would be like, it would have to be because I'd done it, which I honestly haven't. So I don't know. I don't know, the only thing that like comes to mind is that you're right, like it's very hard to do that if you just sit and try and like, see what's going on inside your head. But I think God often helps us in an annoying way by like, when something goes wrong in life, suddenly that wakes us up to things that we might have been ignoring. So like, if you, it's kind of like it's the experience that you have when, someone passes away and you didn't realize how much you like loved them and how much of an impact they were having on you until they were gone, right? That's a beautiful example of what the principle that I'm thinking of. But in the same way, we probably have less healthy desires and needs and wants and stuff inside us that we don't notice most of the time until God, in order to like bring that to our attention, like deprives us of it for a bit, and then we suddenly sort of wake up. Pretty much like any like worldly attachment we have that is disconnecting us from God, the best way God has to like wake us up to that fact is to take it away from us. And so that's a really good opportunity, right? Because he's kind of taken the hard work out of it. You don't have to sit and figure out, am I too attached to my job or to my family or something? Is that preventing me from being properly connected to God? Like, he gives you the answer in a really annoying, painful way. Yeah, but that's the only thing that I can think of. So it's not just the advice is, get hurt so that you can learn things. It's not.
Thank you, Samuel. Any comments from anyone? Because I personally believe this is a very important point, and I didn't know that there was a quote from you. Some of the quotes you said about the person who doesn't know himself. Actually, he said something in Syrian. The Syrian, he said it's a greater miracle to know yourself than raising the dead. I knew it was great. I never actually heard that quote before. It's really amazing. It tells you how much it's important to get to know ourselves. And I think, as Samuel said, it could be painful at the beginning, but it's a very important stage that we need to do. Otherwise, we'll never get to know God. Because think about it this way, guys. If we don't know ourselves, how can we connect to someone who we do not see? It's hard. And I believe, as we actually speaking, Samuel, I actually made the link. A lot of people, or especially youth, we are so bogged down into coming to church and doing spiritual activities and going camps, going meetings, and following the instructions of the church, and do this and do that and fast this and pray that. But when it comes down to really that my core relationship with God is, what am I doing all this for? Who am I connecting with? Sometimes we feel we're talking to the ceiling. Who am I connecting with? Who am I talking to? It's because I don't have that personal relationship with God. It's because I actually was too busy with many things and try to avoid that time to actually get to know God. It's because I didn't get to know myself well enough to be able to know that, to make that step. Yeah. Did I confuse you, or did I confuse everyone? So it's very important to make that link, is for us to know ourselves so we get to know God. And this is the ultimate aim. So thanks again, Samuel. And that concludes our theme, Mountains of the Bible. And outside, you find on the table, you'll see this. It's not just a beautiful icon. It's actually got the program at the back of St. Mary's Revival. The fast will start from Tuesday, the 7th of August, St. Mary's fast. And during that fast, we have a special English revival program, and that's what's printed here. There will be every Tuesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays during this 2-week revival. And we have different speakers, all Reverend Fathers. And the theme of the revival is the spiritual comfort of the heart. So next week, God willing, on Tuesday, will be our first topic in the revival. And the topic will be the true lover, ? And this will be given by Father Samuel Fanous. He will bless us next week to give us that topic, which is part of the theme of the revival. And every topic after that, there'll be topics on Friday, Saturday, as I said, so please take a copy of the program outside. And just quick announcements. Tomorrow, as usual, every Wednesday, we have the early liturgy, the English Youth Liturgy from 5 to 7 a.m. in the morning. And then after that, we do Holy Communion rounds to visit the sick people in hospitals and nursing home. And it's a great service if you'd like to join us. That's every Wednesday after the Mass, 5 to 7 in the morning. And we also have Bible study from 7 p.m. on Wednesdays as well, in the whole day from 7 o'clock. Tonight is a special night because we're actually celebrating a special event. In July 2008, how many years ago was that? 10 years. We started this blessed meeting of ours. So we've been running this meeting on Tuesday nights for 10 years. So it's a great blessing, and we thank God for blessing us for this meeting to continue for a whole decade. It's a great blessing. And we don't forget the effort of Abuna Mikhail. He's the one that started this meeting. Fortunately, he couldn't make it today. So we thank him in his absence. It's him and the youth that started the meeting with him. There's a beautiful group that started the meeting 10 years ago. And thank God it's still going, and it's still a beautiful meeting, and everyone benefiting from it. So we try to find anything from the previous 10 years to try and see. So we found some photos and we put them together in a quick slideshow with some of the photos, as old as 10 and 9 years ago. So we'll have that quick presentation. And after that, we have some special food tonight. We did some barbecue stuff, meat and chicken. So please, after that, go outside. We'll enjoy it together. And we've got a special cake as well to celebrate the 10th anniversary. So, ready? I'd like to thank all the servants who put a lot of effort in preparing this, and throughout the whole 10 years, there's a lot of effort and thought in coming up with the topics, the speakers, organizing the food, organizing everything. As you can see as well here, that was the first anniversary of the meeting, and they actually had a camp as well back then. So would love to do something like that as well nowadays. And please, if you have any ideas or suggestions about how to improve the meeting, or anything you would like to see, or any ideas you have, please come and talk to me or Abuna Mikhail. Would love to hear your feedback. And thanks everyone, so we can stand up for prayer, please. In the name of the Father and Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen.
Thank you, Lord, so much for gathering us all here together. We ask you, Lord, to please help us to see ourselves and each other in the light of the love that you have for us. Amen.
So the prayers and intercessions of Saint Mary, Saint Mina, the intercessors of this meeting, Saint Cyril and Saint Carlos, and the special prayers of the saint of today, Saint Abanub. We thank you, Lord, for this beautiful meeting of yours, Lord. We thank you for giving us opportunity to hear your word, Lord, for 10 years, Lord, in this for the Coptic working youth. Lord, we understand there's a lot of problems, Lord, in the world. We know there's a lot of forces that's pulling us away from you. So we're very grateful, Lord, for the opportunity to be in your church, in a safe haven, Lord, in your bosom, Lord, under your arms, to help us, Lord, to carry on, Lord, our spiritual struggles, and help us, Lord, to be true ambassadors and true Christians, Lord, an example to the world. We ask you, Lord, to bless this meeting, bless the servants, bless, Lord, everyone who labored for the success of this meeting, Lord, and for everyone who attends this meeting, Lord, everyone by his name, everyone by her name, support them, be with them, and bless their lives. And we ask you, Lord, to hear us to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we give those who trespass against us. And lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, for thine the kingdom, power, glory forever. Amen. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And now of God the Father, grace of his only begotten Son, our Lord, God and Savior Jesus Christ, the gift and the communion of the Holy Spirit with you all, go in peace. And the peace of the Lord be with you all. Sorry guys, I forgot to tell you that from next week, for the next 3 Tuesdays, part of the St. Mary's revival according to that program, the timing is different and the place is different. We're starting from 7:30 and we'll be in the small church. So for the next 3 Tuesdays, we'll be in the small church and starting from 7:30, because there's Vespers, glorification, and there's a sermon. So it's a different structure from the normal Tuesday. So please come early, 7:30, in the small church for the next 3 Tuesdays. And now love God the Father, the grace of his only begotten Son, our Lord, God and Savior Jesus Christ, the gift and the communion of the Holy Spirit with you all. Go in peace, may the peace of all be with you all. Please enjoy the barbecue and the cake outside.